Okay, so I think, yeah, people are still coming in from break, but my name is Preston Lee. I'm with VA and Arizona State University. This presentation, I think, is probably a little bit different than what we've seen earlier, and probably will be different from everything that we'll see for the remainder of the afternoon as well, in that most of the projects that we've been looking at have been centering around resources. If you go to, I think it's HL7.org/FHIR, in that levels diagram, whatever that's called, most of the resources that I think are referenced in these projects are kind of at the level 2 through 4 layers, and there's been some reference to measures, I think, which are level 5, but this project's a little different. So Knartwork is a project that is it's more forward-thinking. It is a software project, but the presentation is more about the road that it's going to take to get there, which is years. And the Knart, or Knart, heard it both ways, is a colloquialism for knowledge artifact, or for the HL7 CDS knowledge artifact specification, and Knartwork is just the project name. Scroll. If you don't care about anything I'm going to say, and this makes sense to you, you can play along with the home version and just run it yourself. If it doesn't, then ignore that. So I don't work for a vendor. I'm not trying to sell you anything or trying to consult for you. But there is a core idea that I do want to seed, because this may seem ostensibly somewhat unrelated or kind of an esoteric topic of FHIR, and that these obscure resources that no one really ever cares about. That's not true. And as I mentioned, that the level 5 resources in FHIR, they're not going to be in I don't think, any production environment right now in a meaningful way, but in the future they certainly will be. And if we want to get to the types of cross-organizational plan definition interoperability, such as what VA needs to do, we do need to start thinking about how this is going to work and what it's going to look like in the future. And to me, my baby is the idea of knowledge as computable content. And that when we're creating models of clinical concepts, be it something like blood pressure or something much more complicated, like an order set or a questionnaire in FHIR, ideally in this future state, it should be computable, and it's something that should be plug and play in a very interoperable way, without having to introduce the software and engineering team to a 24-month to 36-month project every time you want to introduce a piece of content that really should be executable from the get-go. So in terms of just general HL7 things, not just specifically FHIR, that are kind of relevant to this idea, clinical reasoning, so those level 5 resources, FHIR terminology, I think it's level 2, the CDS knowledge artifact specification, there's a work group semi work group specifically for clinical modeling. And there's SMART, obviously, and a lot of specifications that aren't specific to healthcare necessary to make this happen. So in this, while I'm just making things up, let's imagine a not too distant future, or in some cases a not too distant present, maybe 5 years down the road, who knows, where we have some tools, some certainly SMART-based, some not, for authoring of clinical knowledge. And in addition to that, if you're going to be doing this modeling, you need repositories. Maybe it's, hopefully it's under the clinical reasoning knowledge, knowledge management service specification in the future, whatever that's going to look like. And there's also an executable part of that as well. So someone had, I think the gentleman from Microsoft had just referenced, the concept of these serverless functions, or these lambdas that you just pass around. Well, that's a concept now that we can do using the clinical quality language in FHIR, where there's logic that you can represent as content, which isn't living in it can flow between different systems, and I have a slide on that in the future. Further, since we're in the future and we're just making things up, we're just speculating now, we do have some sort of production support for some of these high-level abstract resources and types, the profile FHIR questionnaire or documentation template, however you choose to look at it, included. And when these are created, I'm also going to assume that they're developed by subject matter experts, so people that have expertise in that clinical domain. They very often will have some sort of background in informatics, but they may not as well. So these software tools have to be very intuitive, but also support complex query writing. If you're writing things like CQL in a FHIR resource, it needs to have a strong awareness and the ability to dynamically resolve terminologies. Since things are running, now we're introducing the concept of compilation or transpilation. And if you're going to run it, you're going to debug it unless you write perfect stuff every time. These are a lot of concepts which we don't really think about as just when we're just writing instances of resources. But this is coming down the road. And if we're doing this in a team, well, now we have workflows. Now we have these knowledge management systems or services on the back end. And we haven't even really talked about validation and how we can actually test these things in a safe way and then deploy them into production so that they can run, as I said, without the software engineering team coming in for a 36-month project with a huge runway. That's just not going to scale. But again, we're in the future, so we're going to make things even more complicated now. Knowledge artifacts, the concept of knowledge artifact is expanding. And in fact, when you look at clinical reasoning in FHIR, it's not just what some of the predecessor works have really been, but with FHIR profiles being what they are, they're looking to be much more general purpose, and that's a great thing. But they do include logic is intended to execute at runtime so being declared in a resource, but not necessarily being defined in a resolvable way until it's actually run. It's a little different. Well, I mean, it's fine, but there are a lot of challenges that come with that. There's clinical models that may also need to have queries run upon them to do things like class-based queries at runtime. And there's a lot of references that are external to the FHIR backend that you're currently using, and that's very real. And if you're trying to write an interoperable plan definition that's going to allow for people to operate across different organizations, you need to account for that case. So this idea of having these backends that are running knowledge documents at level 5, I think in the future it's not just obvious, but it's absolutely critical to be able to do this in the future. But now we've got major problems. So just as a provider organization, like and everybody here has a wiki of some sort at some place. How does that look? I mean, is that really what you want your clinical management knowledge repository to look like? I really don't think so, especially if those are documents that are going to be running. Just as a patient safety issue, we need to not have a wiki type system. There has to be a lot more forethought put into it. I mentioned references to external terminology as logic that's authoritative to some other department in some other state that reports to somebody else and that you don't even know. We have the runtime aspect of binding to things that are not all coming from the same FHIR sandbox that you used in development. Unless you are a master of the universe, you cannot govern workflow across everybody. So that's a problem. Licensing is a nightmare. Tamper resistance and tamper proofing of resources that span boundaries is also a huge concern. We're not even talking about regression testing, validation, optimization, and just the fact that your clinical informaticians can define something really cool doesn't mean it's actually going to work when you run it. We can very easily create these NP complete problems that are just going to live lock the entire production system if you actually deploy them. And how do we do all of this in a way that's scalable enough that it's not going to take a year plus for every piece of knowledge to actually make it into production? So we can actually do plug and play, not plug and play over the next 36 months per artifact, but go from reduce this time that it takes for a SME to actually make a change to a care pathway, go through some process that's flexible, and then introduce that into a production environment. Okay, so why am I talking about this? Well, as a computer scientist, this all looks very, very familiar. And anyone that's working in a software development environment, I think you know where I'm headed with this, that we've solved or at least have ways of addressing a lot of these problems. And from a tooling standpoint, which was one of my first slides up there, and working with these level 5 resources, we have SME, I'm going to go with SME-friendly-ish tools or concepts that we've been using for decades that we can kind of repurpose for clinical knowledge engineering. And there's this concept that I throw around from time to time is an integrated knowledge environment, which to me is conceptually very similar to an IDE in the software engineering space, where an IKE or IKE is to a knowledge engineer, a clinical modeler as an IDE is to a software engineer. So we have authoring, now we're talking about these level 5, but really all the way down to level 2, level 1 resources in FHIR. Just all the basic CRUDing, be it these knowledge artifacts, resource types, just editing of the things. But we also have support for compilation because we have to be able to do something, or at least some sort of transpilation now to support the logic that's embedded in these resources. We have to support testing. If you're writing it, you've got to be able to run it somehow locally. You can't go through this massive cycle. Every time you're just going to write a basic query. So as a SME, you have to be able to run that and see how it's going to work in a sandbox environment. We have integration, simulation, some sort of governance process, just as we have software configuration management processes in the software engineering world. All of that applies. And ideally, there has to be some sort of open platform or open system, kind of similar to what Eclipse is or whatever your favorite open source IDE is, that we can actually add support, not just for our favorite HL7 specifications, but for non-HL7 stuff that just has to be in the life of somebody that's working in clinical modeling. I have one more slide. In the big bullet point. So as an example, to create an event condition action artifact, as a software engineer, it's no problem. I'm working in this system. I'm going to write some code to do this, right? Well, but that's not the vision I'm trying to paint. The vision is that a subject matter expert in the clinical domain can actually model this in a standards-based way, and there is no software engineer. It's going to go into their sandbox environment. There's going to be some sort of more clinically focused validation. There'll be some sort of performance validation and some sort of review process, but there's not a software engineering project oriented around getting this artifact into production. So the SME actually loads the IK environment and creates it. They set some metadata. They do all of the actual development. They, just as you would with an IDE, they can actually hit run, debug, breakpoint the individual logic within your level 5 artifacts directly within the tool. In a smart environment, it can launch using that against your FHIR sandbox, whatever you're using, backed by your other terminology services and your non-FHIR services as well. Repeat, check it into your knowledge management services, or if you're using document-based, like XML file-based documents like the knowledge artifact specification does, you can do that as well. All right, so just for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. So Knartwork as a project, now the actual software, it's really a teaser of where I think we're going to be in a few years. So it does currently support much of, I'm going to be optimistic. I'm going to say most of. I'm going to go with most. The CDS knowledge artifact specification, a lot of the FHIR support is in progress. It's in flight, and the version 1.0 will support much of the STU3 resources. It's designed to be architecturally plug and play, to be able to introduce support for things like semi-modeling, and then have IDE-like support for resolving terminologies under the covers. I've got some interesting screenshots of just examples you can load up using the tool, blah, blah, blah. All just UI stuff. An example of how something like a response to a questionnaire item, I forget what the resource type is for that, would look like as you're doing it as a subject matter expert, where it's very, very structured, and you're tying every individual data element back to something that's executable. And so when you actually save this to a FHIR backend, we have a chance now in the future of actually making it computable in an automated sense. Here's a live preview of taking one of those documents and displaying it in a way that you can print. and some links, which will take me to the end of my time. So thank you very much.